So, at this point, we probably need to talk about emotion in a little bit more depth. I've given you 2 examples of storytelling which, hopefully for at least some of you, elicited an emotional reaction. In the longer story from Radiolab, The Living Room, you probably experienced a range of emotions from feeling amused to probably sadness. And maybe the same for the advertisement that you watch from Edeka. But what do we actually understand by emotion? We can all give plenty of examples of emotions like happiness, excitement, exhilaration, and so on. But are emotions just then feelings? We need to visit some very basic psychology literature to better understand the concept of emotion and why we have them, the conditions under which they arise, and their relationship to motivation. More on motivation and gamification later. Now, there are several different approaches to understanding emotion, and we're going to start with taking a brief look at a cognitive perspective. A cognitive approach towards understanding emotions sees perception as super important. What this means is that emotion is highly subjective, even when the stimulus is commonly shared. Now, I know that sounds a little bit like a paradox, doesn't it? How can something be subjective when it's shared, right? Well, what I mean is that some events, as stimuli, can easily produce common or shared emotions. But the extent of these emotions, their pleasantness or unpleasantness, of course, and their strength, weak or strong, is subjective. In other words, how we perceive the stimuli is important. So, supposing you're at a football match and the team that you support scores. This will elicit emotions in you that are probably very similar to the people standing next to you who are also supporting the same team. All of you are happy, elated, maybe relieved, and other typical emotions experienced at a game. But now imagine that the person standing to your right is the father of the player who scored the winning goal. His emotion is likely to be a lot more intense than your emotion. Now imagine the woman to your left has placed a bet on this particular team scoring the winning goal. Now, in terms of intensity, her emotion might be as strong as yours, maybe even stronger, but it might be a slightly different emotion than yours, maybe a bit of relief in there. Clearly, not all emotions are shared. Supporters of the opposing team are likely to be not very happy at all when your team scores. So, one event, i.e. one stimuli, producing emotions that can be shared, but which may differ on their specificity and their strength. Now, before we move on, we should note some of the problems in exploring a cognitive perspective on emotion in a research context. First of all is the problem of the subjectivity that we just talked about. When a person reports feelings of happiness, what exactly does happy mean? Different terms mean different things to different people, and trying to operationalise these terms is very difficult indeed. Second, it's very difficult to separate emotions, especially in the context of this subjectivity. Is feeling happy the same as feeling joyful? One stimulus can ignite a range of emotions, some of them conflicting, each of which can also recede or become more dominant over time. Capturing these in an experimental way is almost impossible. And finally, there might be ethical issues in purposefully eliciting negative emotions in people for research purposes. The story that you listened to at the start of the class, well, I kind of debated for quite a long time as to whether I should use it. Now, we're not in a research context, but when I first listened to it, I found it quite powerful in the emotions of sadness that I felt. So I kind of wondered whether I should include it or not. I didn't want to make you cry. It's important for researchers to investigate more negative emotions as well as the positive. If not, we will have a skewed knowledge base. Lots of knowledge on when and how we feel happy, amused, joyful, excited, but not so much on when we feel distraught, inconsolable, angry, murderous even, and so on. But let's now move on to look at emotions from a behavioural approach. The basis of this approach is that emotions are best understood by looking at people's behaviour or external cues in their appearance. Take a look at this picture here. This is a still taken from a project by Philip Toledano that depicts emotions in people playing video games. So, whilst they're playing, a camera mounted on the screen records their behaviour. What do you see here? Well, the chances are that you will all pretty much see the same emotion in this player. Why? Well, because we know from research there is very little variation across cultures in how they understand emotion based on reading facial expressions. One of the key researchers here is a guy called Ekman, and he found exactly that. He also identified 7 basic emotions that, again, held true across a wide variety of cultures. We can have a go here if you like. Look at the 6 pictures in front of you. Each one of these depicts one particular emotion. I've put your choices at the top of the screen there. Press pause and write down what emotion you think is represented. You can do this in your own language if you like, if you're not that confident in English. So, press pause now and then press play when you've done. So how did you get on? These are 6 of the emotions that Ekman identified. Interestingly, these expressions of emotion also seem to be innate. People who have been blind all their lives also seem to make the same facial expressions of emotion as sighted people. Finally, we should mention something about physiology, because when we experience emotion, our physiology changes. Sometimes these changes can be very tiny, too tiny to even really notice. Our central nervous system is activated, as is our peripheral nervous system. Neurological changes occur, more on this a bit later, but for now we're going to take a brief look at some physiological theories of emotion. So, towards the end of the 19th century, 2 researchers, William James and Carl Lang, working independently from each other, came up with pretty much the same theory at pretty much the same time, which is why we talk about the James-Lang theory of emotion. They challenged the common sense approach towards emotion that was knocking around at the time. Up until James Lang, we kind of thought that some sort of event, i.e. a stimulus, would elicit some sort of psychological experience that, in turn, produces a physiological change. So, a lion jumps out from behind a tree, which is the event. We think, that's a lion. Lions are dangerous, therefore I am frightened. That's the psychological response. Our knees then turn to jelly, we sweat, our stomachs churn, and so on. In other words, there is a physiological response as an end point. But James Lang thought the opposite. They proposed that straight after the event, a physiological response occurs, and then the feeling or emotion, if you like, i.e. the psychological response, occurs. So, lion jumps out from behind the tree, our knees turn to jelly, and because of this physiological response, only then do we feel emotion, i.e. in this example, we feel frightened. What do you think? Logical? Well, before you decide, think about the following problems. First of all, it's perfectly possible to have the same physiological reaction to an event, but respond quite differently emotionally. Think back to the last time you were crying because something bad occurred. The emotion that you felt was probably sadness. The crying, remember, is the physiological response to the event. But now think back to a time where you were crying in response to an overwhelmingly good event. Maybe something was so touching or funny. Chances are you were crying because you were happy, amused, or maybe overwhelmingly proud of someone or something. Your tears are the same physiologically, but the emotions felt are really quite different. Some physiological responses do not necessarily elicit emotions of any kind. When we get ready to sit an exam, for instance, we may have a raised heartbeat, but emotion? Maybe a little bit of fear, but maybe not. Maybe we're just focused, and focus and attention are not emotions. Finally, think about the speed of emotions and the speed of some physiological changes. Some physiological changes, like crying, occur after the emotion that you might feel. When you watch a sad film, for example, you feel sad, but you may not cry until the feelings of sadness become overwhelming. Now, there are more cognitive-based and more contemporary approaches to understanding emotion. If it's something that you're really interested in, read the paper on Learn that describes Schachter and Singer's study of emotion. Ethical issues aside, it's really quite interesting, but there's absolutely no requirement for you to read this if you'd rather just carry on with the main course. What I would like to focus on now, though, is the physiology and neurology of emotion. Now, in terms of the former, we know that when some sort of stimulus is present, the thalamus, that's the part of the brain you can see marked by the red dot there, sends signals to both the cortex and the autonomic nervous system. The former, the cortex, that's part of the brain that elicits emotion as a conscious feeling. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for the physiological arousal that we might feel. It's linked to numerous organs and other parts of the body. The thalamus sends signals to both of these systems at the same time. We also know that the thalamus is not the only physiological part of us that is involved in emotion. We know that the limbic system, for example, is involved, and one or two others. We also know that certain chemicals or hormones are released with certain types of emotions. We also know that the thalamus is not the only physiological part of us that is involved in emotion. We know that the limbic system, for example, is involved, and one or two others. We also know that certain chemicals or hormones are released with certain types of emotion. All right, everybody still with me? Good. Why don't we bring our discussion now of emotion into the realm of storytelling? What did you feel when you were listening to either the first story from Radiolab, The Living Room, or the advertisement from Adecco? Probably quite a range of emotions. Some of you may also have become physiologically aroused in that you might have had some tears or at least a sort of heavy feeling in your chest or stomach. That's your autonomic nervous system kicking in, by the way. It is especially powerful when we feel empathy in a story. That is, we can relate to how the person in the story might feel. Either subconsciously or consciously, we might be drawing on our own memories of a personal tragedy, for example, a disappointment, suffering, or other event where we also, just like the characters in the story, feel upset and emotional. Empathy is incredibly powerful in storytelling in two different ways. First, it has the power to elicit strong emotions in the listener because the way that empathy works is to tap into the listener's personal experiences. They are able to imagine the feelings and emotions of the character in the story to a depth that is stimulated by recollections of their own experience. In other words, empathy is powerfully emotive because we get to imagine the character's emotion by reliving our own emotions of a similar event. Now, in storytelling, emotive storytelling, physiological changes occur, and at this point I'm going to focus on neurology. When you were listening to the Radiolab story and possibly the Adecco advert, your brain was responding not just cognitively but also chemically. Hormones are typically released into your bloodstream when we're faced with some sort of stimuli. Now, of course, it doesn't just happen in storytelling. Go back to our lion that leaps out at us from behind a tree. Our brains process this threat and then prepare our bodies physiologically to deal with the threat, i.e. the lion licking his lips. So, neurological signals release adrenaline into our bloodstream, giving us the necessary boost of resources needed to either fight, in our example, kind of stupid, or run away, marginally less stupid, commonly called the fight or flight response. But what does this have to do with storytelling? It doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Well, we don't really behave after a story, do we? We tend to listen to stories as the end itself. There are no behavioural outcomes. Well, actually, fairly recent research suggests otherwise. And an example is from a guy called Paul Zak, who does really great work on neuroeconomics. That is looking at the link between how our brains work and behavioural economics. What he found is that storytelling elicits empathy. And when we feel empathy, a certain hormone, oxytocin, is released. And here's the crucial bit, the release of this hormone appears to change our behaviour in ways that are seemingly unrelated to the story itself. The crux here of Zak's findings and what's relevant for us in gamification is that when we create a story, we have the potential power to design the narrative in a way that can manipulate the behaviour of the audience. You need to remember that. But I think now, though, I've probably talked enough. Click on the next link where I'd like you to listen to Paul Zak describing and showing how he came up with his findings far more eloquently than my efforts to explain things to you. Hopefully, it won't make you cry again, but whilst you're listening and watching, especially in the first part where Zak is describing the story, think about empathy and also recall how you might have felt when you listened and or watched our previous 2 stories. So when you finish, click on the next audio and we'll discuss more about emotion, but this time in the context of games.